Like the body's going to try to respond to this new environment and make the new old. So the new is now the old. In other words, now I want the drink every night or the ice cream every night or whatever in order just to feel normal. So now it's euphoria plus it's euphoria, but I need a little bit more to get that euphoria. And that's the beginning of addiction right there. That's just the beginning.
Welcome to the Weight Loss Surgery podcast, where we have honest and educational conversations about the disease of obesity and bariatric surgery as part of the treatment plan. I'm your host, family nurse practitioner Reeger Cortell. This is episode 104. In this episode, I talk with Dr. Vera Tarman. Dr. Tarman has been working in the field of addiction medicine since 1994 and has been the director of Renascent, an addiction treatment center in Toronto, Canada, since 2006. Although she works full-time in all areas of addiction, her particular passion, or life's work really, is helping people recover from food addiction. She is the author of the excellent book, Food Junkies, Recovery from Food Addiction, now in its second edition. We cover a lot of ground in this episode, including discussing eating behaviors on a spectrum from normal eating to different types of eating disorders. Then we talk about the similarities and differences between what Dr. Tarman identifies as three distinct disease states: obesity, emotional eating, and chemical addiction to food. We then focus in on, specifically, chemical addiction to food. One thing I want to mention right from the get-go is that the issue of food addiction is somewhat controversial. There are those who feel it is not possible to become addicted to food because we biologically need food for survival. But in Dr. Tarman's opinion, and I agree with her, the kind of food we're talking about is not the food we, as human beings, evolved to consume. What we would all call natural food, food that's harvested from the ground, picked from a plant, or hunted with a spear. Not that food. It's the other kind of food that has become a problem for us. The foods that are created in labs, are highly processed, and are specifically formulated to target the reward centers of our brains. When the reward center of our brain turns on, we experience a whole host of generally positive emotions, from feelings of excitement and expectations of pleasure to calm and contentment. When it comes to highly processed food, our brain releases neurochemicals that results in thoughts and feelings of, yes, that tastes especially good, and when I eat it, I feel, at least temporarily, better, happier, calmer, more fulfilled. Now, don't get me wrong. Dr. Tarman and I are not the anti-feel-good advocates. In fact, we want people to feel good, to feel amazing, in fact. But what is so concerning are the false promises that come with highly processed foods, and the price we pay is much higher than we were told, including what Dr. Tarman feels is the growing phenomena of chemical addiction to food. So we get into all of that, and we go into some treatment options for anyone who feels they may be confronting their own addiction to food. But before I get into the episode, I want to let you know that this podcast is listener supported at either Patreon or PayPal. I don't run ads here because I'm frankly not interested in selling you anything. My intent is and has always been education and inspiration. If you feel I have helped you and you are so inclined to give back, patronage is an awesome way to do that at either Patreon, and that's Patreon, patreon.com/Reeger for recurring support, or PayPal for either one-time donation or recurring support. Those links are in the show notes of this episode and are at my website, weightlosssurgerypodcast.com. If you're already a patron, well, thank you so very much. Okay, now on to my conversation with Dr. Vera Tarman. As I've been reading your book, I keep picturing in my mind a line, not a timeline. Well, sort of a timeline, but a line. So if you'll just humor me here for a moment, It's a horizontal line, and in the middle of the line is a dot, and that dot identifies optimal eating behaviors. And then if we move in either direction, to the right or the left of optimal eating behaviors, I picture disordered eating on a spectrum. And in my mind, as I go towards the left, I picture trending towards severe anorexia, bulimia, with maybe a stopping point in the middle, meal skipping. And then if we go towards the right, the extreme end would be a binge eating disorder with or without purge. And in between optimal eating and binge eating disorder, I see overeating. Does that resonate? Does that make sense to you? And clearly this isn't the other way. This isn't just sort of like a one-way train, that if you have anorexia, you can't possibly also have on the right-hand side binge eating disorder, because you can. But I'm just trying to kind of understand eating behaviors separate from what a person's relationship to gravity is.
Okay. I think that's a really good scale to use. And what template you put on top of that to explain that, I think you could use the eating disorder language that you just used, or you could use the food addiction language, which I presume I'll be talking a little bit more about, or a lot more about. But that sort of default or initial way, that continuum is actually very useful. So that you have that middle point, which is optimal, and then the left and the right side, and how we define that, and even the overlay of eating disorder and food addiction and just abnormal eating because of the food that we eat. And we would be fine and not have those disorders if we lived in a normal food environment. Like, I see it as actually a three-layered approach, but I like the fact that there is that basic continuum.
And so can we then start with defining what is optimal eating? Because I don't feel like we have any concept in general of what that looks like.
Yeah.
Is it fair to define it?
I think that your observation that we don't have a concept of what normal eating is, what normal hunger is, what normal satiety is so apt for today, 2019, maybe since 1990 or 1970, that we don't really have a sense of that is just so telling of our environment today. Because I think even a normal eater in this food environment, the processed food industry, and what that does to our hormonal our mechanisms, make it such that we don't even know what it means anymore. And I just think that's an observation that's worth noting. I would define normal eating as you eat when you're hungry, and you know when you're hungry, and then you eat until you're full. That's not overly full, that's full, which is, I like the definition, I think they say that the French do, of you could still eat more, but you're good where you are. That sort of thing. That it's within that realm, so that a person who's a normal eater without any disruptions gets appropriately hungry at, what would it be, the 3 or 4 hour mark post meal, and then gets appropriately full when they've eaten the appropriate amount of food, and that's satisfying to them. Do we know people who actually live that way? I think fewer and fewer, which goes back to the first thing I was saying.
And is there a way to standardize it, or is it internal for each individual? Because I talk to people all the time who tell me they're always hungry and rarely, if ever, satisfied. And when I ask them to define what is hunger for them, they describe what I would consider to be physical signs of hunger. Rumbly in the tumbly, Winnie the Pooh phase, maybe a burning sensation in their stomach, and they'll point to the area, and maybe they feel it in their throat, maybe they feel it in their mouth, or their mouth is salivating. So how do we define if we're going to try and figure out what normal eating is, don't we have to figure out what normal hunger is?
Yeah, but I don't know if you can ask individual people, especially people who are sitting in your office, because they've already, for some reason, found themselves to be disordered or ill in some way, and that's why they're sitting in front of you. And like I said, in today's environment, where the food industry has just messed up our hormonal cues, I don't know if you can ask the person in front of you what's normal. It should be part of the picture, absolutely. But what you described, which could be physical hunger, could just as easily be psychological hunger. Mm-hmm. And a person that has psychological hunger or is eating for fear or comfort, I mean, the ability to determine true cues, it gets lost in the mess of everything. And so I would add that as part of the picture, but not the whole picture. And how do we actually determine what is normal hunger? At this stage, especially like when I have somebody, who's sitting in my office and is, coming because they have a problem with eating, I would more than likely give them what I think is I'd start with, here is what I think a food plan is that would potentially give you normal eating, and then we would use that person's response to hone down what actually works for them. But I don't want to say I wouldn't let them start, but I wouldn't start with their assessment. It would just become part of it. Mm-hmm. And I'm sounding a lot more authoritative than I want to be. But especially with addiction, you can't just go by the gut, because the gut is so messed up with many, many different cues: hormonal, addiction, societal, environmental, psychological. It just gets lost in
Mm-hmm. And so by gut, you're referring to like physically the gut, the gastrointestinal tract, not the intuitive gut. I feel it in my, both. And so going back to my horizontal line,
yes,
I just want to define, even though I think many people understand it, but I want to hear from your definitions, anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorders. How are those defined as eating disorders in the DSM-5?
It's, the classic anorexic ones are that there's a extreme reduction of caloric intake. There's the body dysmorphia, where you see yourselves as being significantly bigger than you actually are, like you just don't see the bones sticking outside of you. That there's an obsession around not eating, or actually eating. It's not, the behavior isn't that, but the obsession is there. And then moving over to the right end of the spectrum with binge eating disorder, that there's a significant amount of food that's being eaten within a very short period of time. So it might be like a day's caloric content within 2 or 3 hours, and that may happen repeatedly. Sessions of that may happen repeatedly over the day, or over a number of days, in order to qualify. And then that's just binge eating disorder. And then moving over to bulimia, where it actually includes purging, which can be anything from purging of laxatives or exercise or actually vomiting. So different ways to get rid of those calories, which then just get replenished with further binging.
Mm-hmm. And then moving on, because this, of course, now that we've kind of touched on different patterns of eating that are normal or optimal, however we want to describe it,
yes.
To profound restricting of calories, to profound over consumption of calories, with or without a way to rid oneself of those calories through chemical means or behavioral actions. This gets us to the next question of why. Why would this happen? And I was so interested to read in your book that you identify 3 very specific reasons that are distinct: obesity, emotional eating, and chemical addiction to food.
Yes. Yeah. So what we were just talking about was the sort of eating disorder continuum. Understanding of this continuum of abnormal eating. In a way, what you've described is that continuum from left to right is just abnormal eating, and then one way to envision that or understand that is using the eating disorder spectrum, which in the paradigm that you just mentioned would be under the emotional eating or psychological. In that I talk about in my book, and eating disorders and that whole, that's a whole other set of professionals that I'm not one of them, as it were. I'm coming from a medical and addiction field, so I just want to be very overt about that. But that perspective tends to look at the psychological dynamics behind eating disorders. So whatever that might be, this is a way of coping with previous history of trauma, previous history of usually it's trauma or familial issues, and that I think the understanding there is, aside from let's learn how to control the eating, the abnormal eating, but it won't really get resolved or managed well until we deal with the psychological precursors. And that's going to be looking at all the coping mechanisms of how to set boundaries and how to deal with previous trauma, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one very, that's what we've been talking about so far. And it's a very prevalent professional medical response. Like if you go to your doctor and say, I got a problem with the way that I eat, you might get sent to a professional who's most likely an eating disorder professional. But I also suggest, and because I think it's actually implicitly political, I'd never meant it to be, as I've been alluding, the food industry's manipulation, either intentionally or non-intentionally. I don't think they were intentionally thinking, how can we mess people up? I think they're just thinking, how can we make our foods palatable so they'll sell, which then ends up messing people up. So there's that whole normal eating or obesity, the result of which is obesity. The person may be a normal eater if they ate the way we ate 200 years ago, 300 years ago, without the whole processed food engineering of our hunger cues, capitalizing on the insulin resistance that develops, and then hunger, which gets malaligned, like that line that you were just talking about. It skirts to one end or the other so that we become hypoglycemic or eat to the point of the other extreme, just in the attempt to normalize. It's not because of a previous history of trauma or that it's a chemical addiction per se. It's just a response to this food that has been engineered to make us want to eat more.
So as I was reading your book and thinking about this and sort of picturing it in my mind, I, of course, go to a Venn diagram of overlapping circles. So
Sure.
One circle has obesity in it, and you clearly identify, obesity as a disease. You also talk about it from a symptom perspective, which
Yes.
I think is makes total sense, and I completely agree. And I think the vast majority of people would also agree, yes, this is a disease, and yes, there's also a symptomatic component of it. The two are not mutually exclusive. People can have both. And that the driver of that is genetic, hormonal, environmental. And you can have somebody who is affected by obesity, who is not an emotional eater and does not have a chemical addiction to food.
Yes, that's
right. But then we've got another circle, which overlaps a little bit, emotional eating. Mm-hmm. You can have people that are emotional eaters who are not affected by obesity and are not addicted to food, but they medicate emotions.
Yes.
But when you overlap obesity and emotional eating, you get more of a problem. And then the third circle, chemical addiction to food, you can have people that are chemically addicted to food, but are not affected by obesity and are not emotional eaters. But you can also have emotional eaters who are chemically addicted to food. You can have people with obesity who are chemically addicted to food. And when you put all three together, you can imagine in the middle, we have a perfect storm.
we have a perfect storm, which makes it so hard to diagnose. And that perfect storm, which I think describes so many of us, is what's slowing down the process of research and funding and the acceptance of this in the DSM-5, because they want things distinguished into separate circles, not overlapping. But the reality is that they do overlap. And this is why we're stuck with this. The obesity doctors are talking about the one thing that I just mentioned, and the food addiction, the eating disorder, that's in the DSM-5, and they're getting good funding. But the food addiction people, we're the last on the list, are not getting acknowledged because we can't find a way to break ourselves out of that mix that you've just talked about. And it's painful because we, I think, are the missing piece, and a really important piece that might help the whole picture.
So I definitely want to do a dive on the hormonal, neurochemical aspect of what's going on so that we can really kind of understand why. But before we segue away from emotional eating, I just want the one sentence which I think sums it up so beautifully when it comes to emotional eating in your book, and I've heard this said otherwise, is it's not what you're eating, it's what's eating you. Like if anybody is wondering, are they an emotional eater? Ask themselves that question. It's not what you're eating, it's what's eating you that's driving the behavior. And then obviously it is what you're eating. But I think that really sums up the state of it. And then from the political perspective, do you think that we are in a similar place to where we were in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s with nicotine and the denial of nicotine as a chemically addictive substance?
Absolutely. I mean, I as I said before, I really did not want to get into the whole political thing, because to me, that just feels like there's no way we're going to win that battle. But of course, that's not a very positive way to look at it. But yes, I don't know if I'm looking from a hormonal point of view, an obesity point of view. I don't know how we can't not address the fact that the elephant in the room, which is that there's foods that are making us normal eaters eat badly, and until we stop, as it were, smoking those cigarettes, eating that food, we have no hope in healing ourselves. We just end up, quote, blaming the victim, and we do all that fat shaming, all that whole business. And it's not enough to just say, let's not fat shame. I would like to say, let's take the energy where we shame ourselves for being fat and turn that energy to what's making us fat and what's making us eat to make us fat. Because it's not about eating, it's about specific foods that are going and creating visceral obesity, causing all those concerns. Because just being slightly overweight, who cares? It's actually very healthy. But it's not when it's the visceral fat and not the subcutaneous fat. And that's
for people that don't understand what visceral fat is versus subcutaneous.
Okay, sorry. It's the fat that goes in the vessels, in the blood vessels. It causes high triglycerides, high cholesterol. It causes diabetes, and it causes the obesity around the gut. It's not the fat or the obesity or the extra weight that goes to the hips and goes to the arms and the legs. And we generally consider non-cosmetic. That's actually potentially, I don't want to say healthy, but it's not unhealthy. It's the fat, what we call visceral fat, the internal fat, that basically sugar is the cause of sugar. Pardon me, sugar has caused. It's the excess sugar that shouldn't be floating in the blood vessels, causing damage to our eyes and our kidneys, et cetera, going to the stored in the fat cells and causing all sorts of what we call metabolic syndrome, all sorts of conditions in 5 to 10 years that will kill us.
Mm-hmm. So now I want to kind of segue a little bit into your personal story, because clearly this is something that professionally you're very passionate about, but you also have a personal story that ties into this.
Yes, sure. I'm happy to do that. Yes, my own story is that I am not somebody who, as people use the language of, that comes from big numbers. I was probably just a normal-sized kid, but in university, I got on the same way of thinking that almost every young woman in my circle did, which was I'm big and I've got to lose weight. And I got into a thing of, we like to live by extremes. Many people do. And I got into a thing of, well, I'm going to go on a diet. And I found that just to go on a mild diet was not very satisfying because weight loss was too slow and it just didn't feel like I was doing the work, good work towards it. So I got on a really extreme diet for which I lost a lot of weight fairly quickly, but I got down to like almost 105 pounds. And for my height, which is 5'7", that was enough that I looked really thin. People were commenting on it, which of course I thought was great. But I lost my period and I started getting faint all the time. And basically symptoms that now would have been classified as anorexic-like moving in that direction. And the idea about the fact that I had lost weight, which was good, but it was never quite enough. I got into that whole thing. And I only stopped that because I found that it was affecting I was at university, it was affecting my ability to concentrate and do school, and that was more important than anything else. Although this was next, like friends were not as important as my diet and whatnot. So anyway, I did that, and then what happened, which I think happens to a lot of people, I don't think this was addiction at this point, is that rather than just reintroducing a little bit of food, all of a sudden I just basically moved into binge category. It was like one day I'm not eating, okay, now I'm going to eat, and it went right over into binge category, and I couldn't stop eating. And when I tried to stop, and I thought, well, this is not any better than the other. I tried to go back to the anorexic or restricting eating and couldn't. I just couldn't. What I found is that I was obsessed about food to the point where I actually took myself to an emergency department. And this is in the 70s or early 80s, where the whole concept of eating disorders was still relatively new. And I think that probably somebody would have said I had some version of eating disorder then, but they didn't really know what to say. I just said, I don't want to go home because I will binge all night. And they said, sorry, you can't stay. Anyway, that was the end of that. So I continued to binge until I gained back all that weight plus more. Typical story. That's the story of almost everybody. As I continued to try to struggle with this, more and more, not research, because I wasn't interested in research at that point, but more and more information was coming out about eating disorders. And it never really sat with me as this makes sense. It was just something like, yes, that looks like me, but it's not helpful, this information. I eventually found that I could manage the whole thing to some degree of doing other addictive things. I would eat, or I would smoke pot, or I would overwork, or I would drink alcohol. I found some way over a period of 20 years of managing the extreme eating behavior. I mean, I went up to top 240 pounds, 100 pounds more than I am now, and kind of coasted there doing various compensatory behaviors. By then,
would you call that transfer addiction?
Yes, I would. I wouldn't have called it that then. I would have just said, I'm managing whatever this is. It always felt like this beast inside of me. I described that in the book as this, it was like this heaving beast that was inside me that would either come out sometimes or be quiet, latent, but I could always hear its breath in the background. And when I got in the addiction field and started to learn that language, the penny just dropped one day. And I thought, oh my God, this just feels like that speaks to me more than anything else. And I, of course, didn't know anything about hormonal and that whole piece. But the addiction model really fit for me. And so I then, on my own, decided, well, I'm going to do the same thing they suggest, which is just quit the substances that really, really drive this, like sugar and stuff like that. Because I'd found that the occasional time when I stopped eating sugar, it quieted, that beast got quiet. But then I would think, well, okay, there was nothing that told me I shouldn't pick up again after a while because things got better. So now I can sort of moderate my use again. But that didn't work that way. And now all of a sudden it made sense because I had the addiction paradigm to make it make sense. But I kept it quiet because every time I talked about it, the eye rolls of my friends, and then I didn't see anything in the professional literature that would support that way of thinking. If nothing else, negative, like the whole eating disorder paradigm was becoming more and more prevalent. But it was when I came across Nicole Avina's work, we mentioned her.
Just to interject, Dr. Tarman is referring to Dr. Nicole Avina, world-renowned neuroscientist and author of the book, Why Diets Fail, Because You're Addicted to Sugar. Science explains how to end cravings, lose weight, and get healthy. Dr. Avina was a past guest on this podcast back in episode number 18, if you want to check that out.
And actually, it was her work, but brought up in the American Society of Addiction Medicine. Oh my gosh, I forget her name. She's my hero. She started talking about, let's add food to the transfer addictions. So there's cocaine and alcohol, and then there's gambling, and then there's sex, and there's this and that. Let's add food to that. I thought, okay, now I can professionally speak about this because I've got this series of articles with science, thanks to Nicole Avina and her colleagues, to justify what I'm saying. Be damned with your eye rolls. I'm going to go out there. And what we're finding now, just, moving forward into the last 5 to 10 years, more and more and more research is supporting that some foods like sugar, like simple carbohydrates, are actually driving an addiction dynamic. And that's what we are now. And more people are accepting of that. Like, I think the tipping point of acknowledging that is happening more and more. That's great. Where I think we are, where I am, where you and I are now saying, okay, let's take that knowledge and take it one step further into the clinical world and apply that, because we don't see the application of it in the clinical world yet. It's still in the research. It's still in the popular literature as, oh, wow, isn't that interesting? Rats choose cocaine over or sugar over cocaine. Well, let's take that knowledge and apply it concretely to our patients, because we're not seeing that yet. Mm-hmm. The medical profession is still saying, and I'm sorry to say it, my colleagues, in the obesity field, except for the few enlightened ones, are still saying, no, we've got to learn to moderate. We can't refuse or we can't deprive people of these normal foods. They're not normal. They're not normal.
So, what do you say to people when they say, how could a person be addicted to food? Because it's something that you need to live. Obviously, we don't need cigarettes. We don't need gambling. Yes. We don't need alcohol.
I just sigh and I try to restrain my frustration and pulling up my hair and say, I'm not talking about food. I'm talking about Franco food. I'm talking about the stuff that we call food, like Snickers and candy bars. That's not food. It's the food industry's deliberate. I mean, I'm going to sound like a rabid person here, but it's like I'm saying I don't want to get too crazy.
It's okay. You're in a safe place.
Okay, thank you. Croissants and things like this are not necessarily normal food. When we talk about food, go ahead and eat strawberries and berries and vegetables and eat them to your heart's delight, because your heart will stop when it should, or your stomach will stop. It's that other stuff that's not really food that many people, many professionals don't want to make that distinction, because they're afraid they're going to, quote, deprive people and make them binge. They won't binge if they're happy eating what they're going to eat, and healthy foods. And that's the message of hope that I want to get out eventually, and hopefully again at the end of our talk, is that the message of hope here is that if you eat real food, you're not going to feel deprived. Mm-hmm. But let's define what's real food and what's not real food. What's crap, or processed food, basically. Mm-hmm. Food that has been engineered to make us want to eat more than we should, than we need.
So let's follow a molecule, if we can, as best as we can, of this food. So let's just say a person is eating something on the sweet spectrum, and, Snickers bar, Jolly Rancher. Choose your sweet spectrum processed food, or honey included, or salty crunchy. Lay's potato chip, Triscuits, or something in between, piece of white bread, right? It's not really sweet. It's not really salty, but what happens on a hormonal neurochemical pathway? Because it goes both ways, right? It goes down to the stomach and up to the brain.
Yes, it does. And that question, it's a very simple question, but it's a very complicated answer. And I'll try to, I'll try to be simple. But I mean, it's a great question because if we can get that one down into a soundbite, oh my God, I would push that one everywhere. But I'm going to try to make it as short, whatever, as clear as possible. So, what happens with the Jolly Rancher or whatever it is, first of all, if you imagine things on what we call the glycemic index of how quickly things turn into sugar, normal foods, not the Jolly Rancher, but like a potato or a sweet potato or a carrot or whatever, the glycemic index, or how quickly it breaks down into sugar, is, I think it's somewhere between 40 and 60 or 70 maybe, but not 100, which is sugar. And anything that's beyond like a 60 and gets closer to the 100 is breaking down into sugar very quickly. And it means that you could eat more of that within a shorter period of time. And now I just want to go back to what is normal, my body normal, your body normal, and the normal of 100 years ago, 200 years ago, which is, I'm going to just say, is the way that we should at least be eating, not necessarily hunter-gatherer, but just not this processed stuff. Anyway, because the processed stuff has made everything from what could be at the top end 70 now to 90 and 100, if you get what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. Like a bagel might be 80, but there's nothing normal about a bagel. It's something that we process to make it a bagel. So anything that is in the 60, 70 range or under, the body can handle, the response to a carbohydrate that is somewhat complex, not simple, is that it eventually, insulin rises, pancreas creates insulin to match the sugar that's coming in. There's lots of time. I can only eat so many carrots before I'm full, so I'm not going to have that many. So there's a sort of limited amount built into real food, whereas there is not with processed food. I can eat way more, so that my body can handle a certain amount, and that's great. And my insulin response will not be overly compensating, and my neurochemical response similarly. I'll enjoy the food, and I'll be able to manage it without getting all sorts of diseases like metabolic syndrome, et cetera, et cetera. You get beyond that point, and things start to become overwhelmed. And one example of overwhelmment is insulin resistance. An insulin receptor, which would normally take in a certain amount of sugar, like up to 70 glycemic. I hope I'm not getting too complicated here.
Nope. Go for it.
Okay, so it can handle that, but when it's getting beyond that, it's becoming overburdened and eventually becomes resistant. It's like the receptors no longer, they become faulty and not working so well, and then essentially that cell is insulin resistant. It can't use the insulin anymore, and therefore it can't use the sugar, and now we have type 2 diabetes because of basically an overabundance. And the same phenomena happens with the neurochemical response, because we get pleasure when we eat. That's the neurochemical of dopamine. And, the pleasure of eating normal food have a certain amount of dopamine, not overly. Like when I eat carrots, I love them when I'm hungry, or Brussels sprouts, I love them when I'm hungry. That's the heightened dopamine response. What happens in the processed food industry is the dopamine just gets more and more heightened. Because as I become insulin resistant, I start to crash. I start to desire more sugar because I'm not getting the sugar to the brain anymore. And therefore, my dopamine is high. And so I'm still thinking about food, even though I'm potentially full. The whole finely tuned system gets lost and overwhelmed. That's the disease, as it were. And that disease gets worse and worse over time as the system becomes more and more faulty and unresponsive. And then eventually what happens, I think, this is where I think that you can become broken forever, is that a person, long-term food addiction, may have to quit a lot of foods that an earlier stage food addict may not. Like they can't eat sugar anymore. They can't eat flour anymore. Now they can't even eat grains anymore. And guess what? Now they can't even eat dairy anymore. Like it gets more and more restrictive. But if they're within the framework of what they can eat, they're still happy with what they're eating. It's not like there's no feeling of deprivation if you find the food plan that works.
So we eat food, the chemicals are released from our gastrointestinal tract and from pancreas.
Yes.
which then trigger the brain
Yes.
to release the neurotransmitters.
Yes. So ghrelin.
The star one is dopamine.
Yeah, ghrelin and insulin kick in dopamine, and leptin actually suppresses dopamine. Through other hormones like neuropeptide Y1, but I don't want to get that technical. It's just a good way to understand that is just that it's mainly through dopamine. Ghrelin and insulin kick it in. So ghrelin makes you, start thinking about food. That's dopamine. Now, when you're thinking about food and that's all you can think about because you're starving and you have to eat within, this is what happens with anorexia, then we're looking at an insulin response because insulin is going to boost up that dopamine because if you're starting to get hypoglycemic, in other words, you don't have enough sugar to feed your brain, if you don't get it, eventually you can become comatose and die. So the brain has a tremendous need to get you to eat sugar or something, and therefore the drive of the dopamine spike to make sure you get out there and eat is going to be much more potent when insulin is involved. So those two drive insulin, and then leptin will suppress it.
Mm-hmm. And with the highly processed foods, they're causing a higher release of dopamine than what would, eating apple flavored candy versus an apple. Exactly.
Yes. Because you're getting so much more simple carbs. Yes. And they're driving the whole thing. That's right.
One of the kind of descriptor sentences from your book that really resonated with myself, and I'm sure everyone is going to be like, oh yeah, eating the highly processed foods, it's as if our brain were designed to run on diesel and suddenly we're giving it rocket fuel.
Yeah.
Our gray matter, being the brain, has not evolved quickly enough to handle these surges to efficiently temper the supercharged rewards.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. And this is what happens with any addiction. We have our own endorphins, which are our pain neurochemicals, so that if I twist my ankle or do better still, if I, go out and work out and, do heavy or jog the marathon or something like that, I get this flood of endorphins, and that's really great. But if I take those endorphins and supercharge those like rocket fuel through a pill called OxyContin or Dilaudid or heroin or Percocets, or I'm not sure what they call them in the
Percocets. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Then we're talking about rocket fuel of endorphins, and this is the thing that happens with addiction, which is that third paradigm. Is if you live in that environment for too long, you start to become tolerant, which means the body starts to expect that rocket fuel, and then we can't. That's when the person says, "I can't imagine living without my bread, without my sugar, without my ice cream at night, because if I don't have it, how will I survive the night?" Because they become dependent on it, just like the person has become dependent on their OxyContin or whatever it is.
So, yeah, you stated in your book, addiction is the land of never-ending want.
Yes.
So let's talk just, because we're diving into addiction and its definitions. Does it sort of start with use and then building of tolerance?
Yeah.
Which then results in withdrawal?
Right. Yes, exactly. So it's the same pattern with food as it is with drugs, as it is with nicotine, cigarettes, as we mentioned. You have the first, I guess we call this the honeymoon period, where you have the initial time, you have the wonderful, delicious, oh my God, it was so good, croissant, warm and toasty and melting in your mouth kind of stuff, wonderful. And that lasts, I don't know how long. It's like the first time you take your first hit of heroin or alcohol. And then at a certain point, the body recognizes this rocket fuel, because it's only supposed to feel, the pleasure of eating a banana or eating carrots or something like that. So you're getting this experience of euphoria. Which
is the dopamine release.
It's the dopamine release with just pure dopamine release Great, lovely, we like it. But then what happens is the body recognizes this supercharged rocket fuel and starts to adapt to it. It's just like insulin. Like the body recognizes, oh, more sugar, better boost that insulin, start creating more receptors to adapt to all that extra sugar. Like the body's going to try to respond to this new environment and make the new old. So the new is now the old. In other words, now I want the drink every night or the ice cream every night or whatever in order just to feel normal. So now it's euphoria plus, it's euphoria, but I need a little bit more to get that euphoria. And that's the beginning of addiction right there. That's just the beginning. And if a person stops there, they're probably okay. In other words, they haven't hurt their receptors, they haven't damaged anything, and they can probably go back to normal, even moderate eating. But what happens is we don't know what we're doing, and so you want that delicious feeling again. But so now instead of just a bag of something chewy that you liked, now you have to have a bag and a half to get that same pleasure, and now you have to have 2 bags. And then at a certain point, what happens is it's this invisible line of where does something become addictive versus just the condition of addiction. And that's when I'm not eating anymore to get that euphoric pleasure. It's I'm eating now so that I don't feel bad if I don't. Because the new, I need that now. I need the 2 bags of whatever it is in order just to feel normal. I need 3 to feel better, but I need 2 to feel normal. But the 2 is already causing damage. My sugars are going up. I've already gained that 30 pounds that I said I would stop if I reached that point. I've already reached the point of damage and I want to stop now, but I can't, because if I stop, I'm going to feel worse. And so that when you get into that land of you can't not use and you can't use, like there's no win, that's that point at which now it's becoming an addiction. And then the person will continue to use, not because of the euphoria. It's like they've given up. Like you ask a food addict, are you actually enjoying your food? They will look up probably with tears in their eyes saying, no, I keep hoping I will. That's the dopamine, the hope, the anticipation, but I'm not. But I can't not, because if I don't, I'll feel bad. And bad means I'm going to go into withdrawal. The withdrawal being, how will I sleep without that ice cream at night, or that bottle of wine, or that whatever it is that I need? How will I not get through the day without my cigarettes?
And so when we go back to kind of my Venn diagram, obesity, emotional eating, food addiction, do you think, is it possible to say that emotional eating and food addiction are more closely tied than obesity and food addiction? Or not really sure what I'm asking, other than these are not isolated from each other.
Oh, no, I think that the more we move down that continuum that you were talking about earlier, like to the right, the more muddy everything becomes. Because I've seen people, there's one person that I talk about in my book who dealt only with eating disorders. And she
as a professional, as treating.
Yes,
okay.
She started talking about bulimorexia or something. I can't remember what the term was now.
Yeah, I think that was it, bulimorexia.
Yeah, and it seemed like the more the person got over that edge, the more everything became muddied up, because the anorexic would go into, so the anorexic is heightened dopamine, like they've been on dopamine highs, just the anticipation of eating acutely. Now they're going into an environment, like a hospital environment, where they're trying to make them gain weight, so they're giving them super, super simple carbs. But they're like trigger happy with dopamine, and the sugar is just like, whoa. And so now they become addicted, as well as having an anorexic disorder. Like, I think you can, when you're at the extreme of one Venn, easily jump into the other. Now you've got a mixture of both, which is what she was talking about, that clinician in my book, talking about how now we're talking about 2 disorders overlaid on top of each other, when it didn't have to be that way. She said, if I got those anorexics before the hospital did, I would have gotten them to eat foods, but not simple foods, and I might have been able to treat their anorexia without introducing now the whole dilemma of food addiction.
Mm-hmm. And how common do you think it is, if we're looking at populations of people who are affected by obesity, that there's also an overlap of emotional eating and or food addiction?
I think it's potentially more and more, because we know that the more the higher the body mass index, the more dopamine 2 receptors become distorted, disturbed, altered. We see that there's research to show that, and so that already tells me that just by virtue of those dopamine 2 receptors, which are mainly the receptors that we studied, there may be more. There are actually dopamine 3, dopamine 4 receptors. We're not really sure what they do yet, so we focused on dopamine 2 as of now, and that's the main dopamine receptor that we study for addiction in general of any kind. And it doesn't surprise me that people who are obese, especially after surgery, become more prone to alcoholism. The dopamine 2 receptors of the body mass index increase are heightened. Now they pick up something that immediately takes that liquid sugar and triggers off those dopamine receptors that are now altered just by virtue of the body mass index going up.
That was something that was interesting when I had my conversation with Dr. James Mitchell earlier this year, who has done a lot of research on addiction and pre- and post-bariatric surgery with more of a focus on alcohol addiction. And in conclusion with that, and I think it had to do with the dopamine 2 receptors, not having a history of alcohol use prior to bariatric surgery did not absolve a person of risk post bariatric surgery, and that it was not necessarily even that we could say, well, emotional transfer addiction. It was chemical.
Yeah. Yes. It's double, because you've got the, I would argue that there's two ways that a person can become predisposed post-bariatric surgery. There's the higher body mass index, which already predisposed, their dopamine 2 receptors are already altered by virtue of that. Now they're doing a surgical alteration of their absorption response, so that they're absorbing more quickly something that's liquid, much more quickly than food, because they can't take that much. That will slow down the process of the metabolism. So now they're taking an intoxicating substance, which virtually doubles or triples. Like one drink will equal 2 or 3 drinks for a person that's been post-bariatric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we've got the surgical predisposition plus the previous body mass index predisposition, and that's a person that's walking into, and as far as I'm concerned, theoretically walking into a potential for alcoholism. And I'm only saying that theoretically, but we can see that. I mean, we can see that just by clinically observing that. I see lots of people.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely something that I caution people about, to be very attentive to. Yes. But along the lines of bariatric surgery and dopamine, I don't know the authors, but there was a study that came out that showed that the dopamine reward pathways were altered in a way that was beneficial for weight loss maintenance, because there was less dopamine excitement at the neurochemical level, so less reward from eating. And okay. I do see this in absolutely in a subset of patients that no longer receive the same reward.
Oh, but are they drinking more, or what?
Not necessarily. No. Okay. Again, okay. It sort of depends. Now we get into the gray zone of what was driving their behaviors. For some people, it's, they kind of shrug their shoulders and say, I have to set an alarm clock to remind myself to eat. That was never the case prior to surgery. And so I do that, because if I don't do that, I don't feel good. And so I give my body the energy in the form of food that it needs, and on I go. There's another subset of people who feel a lack of the reward, a lack of fulfillment, and are seeking a little bit of that. The high, I guess, is the word that's coming to mind.
Yeah.
And that is somebody that I would identify as being at higher risk for a transfer addiction.
Reeger, I gotta say, that's very interesting, because I've never met the first category. Mm-hmm. That's really interesting to me. But then I wouldn't meet that category, because they're not the person struggling with food. I would meet the second category, and that might be what the difference is. I'd love to do a study on those two subsets of the population. What is it that makes that first person different than the second, which is the one that I see, which says that no matter I don't have very much, I can't fit that much in there, but I still want to eat. So they'll eat slushies and whatever else. But I find that very interesting.
Right. It isn't, boy, talking to people prior to surgery, it's, we can come up with all the screening tools that are out there. It doesn't necessarily always help me predict who's going to be on the other side of surgery and have minimal struggles, and who's going to be on the other side of surgery and have more struggles than I would have been prepared for. I do, the studies that are done on bariatric surgery do demonstrate that the process of manipulation of the gastrointestinal tract, so we're specifically talking about vertical sleeve gastrectomy, Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, and duodenal switch. We're not talking about gastric banding, which has definitely fallen out of favor, but those three surgeries increase leptin as well as amylin, GLP-1, CCK, glucagon, and PYY, all of which are the hunger, craving, satisfaction hormones, and decrease ghrelin. So that's been studied and demonstrated.
Yeah.
But, the effects are not lasting forever, for many people. But although having said that, every time I'm going to make a statement, I'm going to counter it with, well, there's that exception. I absolutely do have people that years later still ask them, talk to me about your relationship with food. Food is fuel. I take it because I need to. Yeah.
Yeah. I find that very interesting. Mm-hmm. That's almost to me like, I used to work in the HIV field, and in the old days when we didn't, before we had the meds that we have today, we looked at the people who are the long-term survivors, like how is it that HIV, but your CD4 counts are not dropping, without meds, and you're not dying. Like there's something about that population that survived. And it makes me think that there's something about this population that hasn't to the addiction thing. I find that very intriguing.
Right. And it's, every time I kind of dip my big toe in these topics, I just find myself wanting more the definitive phenotype and genotype.
Yeah.
So that we could understand for each individual person what's going to be the optimal treatment based on phenotype, not only physically how they look, but emotionally how they respond to stressors, post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic growth, and then genotype.
Can I just ask you though, just quickly, one thing, that population that you're talking about, did they start off eating the kind of food that you suggested, which was no doubt not processed garbage, but good food? Like, did they start off in a way that set them to continue to not get overwhelmed by, food cravings because of the food itself?
I would say in general, yes, there's less reliance on highly processed convenience foods in that subset of population who have an easier go of it. I don't mean to say it's all rainbows and unicorns and there's no challenges on the other side of bariatric surgery, but they've overcome some of those societal and cultural obstacles and also financial, right? It is a little bit more expensive to eat from on the healthier food spectrum, even if those foods are not organic. I'm not even talking about driving people towards organic foods, but food deserts are a very real issue.
Yeah. Yes. Right. But anyway, so that might actually be an explanation then, in the sense that they may have been predisposed, but they didn't actually, like epigenetics, they didn't actually have the environmental cue that opened that potential up because they started off in a better place.
Mm-hmm. Right. Less hurdles to overcome.
Yeah.
In all cause hurdles. Interesting.
Yeah.
So how do we as clinicians and people that are listening who are affected by obesity, how do they start understanding whether they are somebody who's struggling with a food addiction in and of itself? I do feel like many people intuitively feel like, oh gosh, you kind of got my number there.
Yeah, it's the same as my own experience. Like once I started hearing about that concept of addiction, it just rang like, yes, this is it. And I think that the best way to know is is that if it's a struggle, we call it withdrawal, we call it post-acute withdrawal. To take a month, this is why I do my sugar-free September. I mean, of course, I would suggest people do sugar-free for life, but try for a month and take the support you can to get through the hurdle of post-acute withdrawal, which lasts about a month. And then if you find that your cravings are quieter and for crappy food, I'm not talking about not being hungry and not eating and all that stuff, because I'm not into the intermittent fasting thing by any means. That's a whole other area. I'm not talking about depriving. You can be full. But if you stop those foods and you find that your cravings, like that mental space that gets taken by what will I have tonight, and as soon as I'm done now, what am I going to have later? All that stuff. I mean, I remember thinking about food all the time. It was always this chatter in the background of whatever I was doing. If that gets quieter, there's something that's the addiction piece that I'm talking about. It's not actually about weight loss or about the foods and all that stuff. It's the chatter. And if that quietens, then I think that now you've got a sign that there might have been an addiction involved. I wish we could, just like you're saying with your work, I wish we could know ahead of time. We don't have a tool to distinguish that, but we do after a month. I think that's enough time to decide for yourself. Is it the chatter?
So you mentioned Sugar-Free September.
Yes.
What is that? Talk to me about what this is a program that you do every September?
This will be my second year, but I'd like to do it now because I love this idea. But I come from an addiction framework, so the idea is always abstinence. But abstinence is a scary topic. How can I never eat sugar again? How can I never eat bread again, or whatever it is? And so we always say in the addiction world, one day at a time. Can you do it for today? And practically speaking, there's a number. I haven't come up with this idea by any means, but if you'll look on the internet, you'll find that there's lots of people who do like a month-long sugar-free something or other. Mm-hmm. I have myself decided to do that. So I have on my Facebook a page called I'm Sweet Enough, the September Sugar-Free Challenge. It's actually sugar-free for life. But every September I'll say, for those of you who have fallen off from last September or the ones who want to get on for a month, join up and grumble about how difficult it is, ask for food plans, do all sorts of things. It's free. And then if you like what you see, if the chatter goes down, then you might decide to do something more long-term, either with a food coach or a counselor or a 12-step program or whatever it is to help you do this for life one day at a time.
Which 12-step programs help with this? Overeaters Anonymous?
Yeah, Overeaters Anonymous would be the biggest one, and I would suggest that first because it's the simplest one. I talk about this in my book too. It's the it's the mother of all food programs. It's the oldest one. A lot of people complain about it because it's so big. They don't offer a specific food plan. You can even eat sugar and be in that plan. So you have to kind of look for the group that works for the food plan you want. But it's good because you're at least getting support and you're getting to hear about other people so that you don't feel alone, you don't feel shamed, you don't feel embarrassed either about your weight or about your food. Like people are embarrassed by how they eat. I was embarrassed. I was just so ashamed. I can talk now about it quite openly because I've I've spoken enough about it and had enough people nod their heads and laugh that I no longer feel, oh my God. But there was a time when I felt abhorred at my behavior, and I know other people feel that way. So just being in an environment where other people are doing the same thing or have is really, really affirming. I'm not this weird, horrible, disgusting person. That whole shame thing.
So I know you've kind of touched on that abstinence is frightening for people.
Yes.
And so maybe it's baby steps and maybe it's 30 days. But if you were to let's just talk about what would total abstinence look like? Total abstinence from what specifically? Can you name it?
Yeah. So first of all, I wouldn't even say 1 month, but the 1 month I'd say
1 day, 1 hour.
Yeah, 1 day, 1 hour, but sign up for a month of support, or
Mm-hmm.
or whatever. That's usually enough to at least know what you want. But I would say, we have to look at what are the most addictive foods. Well, the processed food industry you may as well just say that that's probably all of that stuff is addictive. But if we want to be really straightforward, sugar. That is not within the natural form that it was nature, like an apple, the sugar in an apple, no problem. The sugar of fruit, the sugar of vegetables, fine. But when you take anything where the sugar has been refined and put into something else, in other words, processed food, avoid, stop. And that would be the first thing. I tell my my patients who are in treatment centers for other drugs, if you can just stop the soda, you're going to be doing yourself a world of good. So even if it's just that, but then, and people will do that, but they still struggle with cravings, a lot of them. And so then I say, okay, well then now, the simple carbs, like the flour products like donuts and croissants and bagels and muffins. I used to think muffins were healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. That we know how healthy they are. So knock them off and see how you are there. And a lot of people are good with that.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that as people become older, and I see a lot of women in terms of food. Post-menopausal, I find that grains become harder to process, and that sometimes people have to stop grains too. But this is like now we're moving down the edge of how long have you been struggling with food? If it's been years and years and years, and there's been lots of losing weight, gaining weight, losing weight, gaining weight. Like every time you go through that, it's not just the damage that's doing to the receptors, etc. It's also, you're building in psychologically like this sort of learned helplessness that I have always tried and failed and I never succeed. Like all that kind of learning it's very damaging. I don't know how else to say it, but damaging. So I think that the addiction gets worse the more we fast and fail and fast and fail. So anyway, that's a person that may have to stop grains too, and hopefully that's the end of the thing. But I do find that that the longer the person's been struggling, the more restrictive the food plan has to be. But I would start with sugar, and I think it can be tailor-made.
So sugar, glucose, fructose, sucrose, lactose, maltose, dextrose, all the OSE words.
Yes. And for some people, I'd say maybe half, even sweeteners. But some people...
As in artificial sweeteners?
Yes, that's right. Some people can get away with some stevia and they're good, but others can't. So that's something that I would never suggest that somebody try to do this on their own, because when we're now using the addiction paradigm, we're recognizing that you're dealing with a hijacking of a part of our brain that is subconscious, sub-willpower. It's even below the level of conscious willpower. So I need to ask somebody else, at least to be I can't do this on my own, because I will convince myself that anything is fine. But I need to have somebody else, like you, if you were my counselor, to say, okay, do you think I could do sugar once in a while? And you just look at me and say, come on, I don't think so. So you want to have a food buddy or a food coach or something, sponsor, to help you figure out and tailor make your own food plan.
So once this resonated with you personally,
yes,
and you confronted this head on.
Yes.
OMG, this is me. And how long did it take for you to really implement the plan and live a life of abstinence, how you're currently defining it, which I'm curious how you define it. Like, what are you abstinent from?
Okay. So
did you go into it kicking and screaming?
Not yes and no. I was already pretty tired of this whole battle. So I'd say maybe now 13 years ago, I decided I was going to stop sugar and booze, because I found that when I drank, to eat, or vice versa. Like, to me, they're hand in hand.
Okay.
So I stopped those, and that worked. I lost the weight that I had gained. That was great. It wasn't about weight anymore, though. But I still struggled with amounts, and it wasn't. It was like the noise went from 8 or 9 out of 10 to 7 or 6 out of 10. But I still wasn't satisfying. And then I read about a 12-step group that knocked out flour, and I thought, holy cow, are you kidding? But I was willing to try that, and that made a huge difference. I didn't want to join that particular group because I thought they were a little bit too strict for me. I went to OA to some degree. I still wanted to do it on my own. That brought it down to like a 4 out of 10, and then I found it actually. So I'm not really supposed to say this too explicitly, but I guess I will, because you're asking me. I found it a 12-step group that said, okay, knock out the grains too. So now I do no sugar, no flour, no grains. And that did it for me. It was like, okay, so that was now 4 years ago. It took me from 13 years ago to 4 years ago to find out what I needed for me, Vera. I then decided to join that group because I really found the accountability of meals, like what I tell the person what I'm going to eat each day, and only change that in the context of them knowing about it. Extremely helpful. It took the can I do a little this? Can I change this? What if I, all that the
thinking, rationalizing.
Yeah, the chatter in there just got wiped out because it's like, no, not doing it. This is the rule.
It's interesting because I think, from the perspective outside looking in, a person might view this and think, oh my gosh, so trapped.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Where do you get the freedom, the spontaneity?
Yeah.
But when you're on the inside looking out, you actually see the freedom.
Yes, you do. That
right.
I got free by handing over the control. It just opened up freedom. It was like, oh my God, I feel like I'm no longer afraid of food. I used to be terrified. What if this is going to make me want to eat or gain weight? My weight has been stable in the last 4 years, and I know what I'm going to eat. It's like I don't think about it anymore, nor am I afraid, so I can enjoy the food that I eat. I can tell you what I ate today. I love the food that I eat, and I'm not afraid of it anymore. And oh my God, I have not had that experience since I was 15 years old. And,
wow. Wow.
16.
So yeah, along those lines, just to give listeners a sense, what does a typical day look like for you and the food that you're choosing to eat specifically, and calories you might be drinking?
Okay, so drinking, I only drink water and black coffee. And I know I probably drink a little more black coffee than I should, but I try to keep it to before 11 or 12 in the afternoon, in the morning, and then decaf after that. But I admit I do. That's when I'm not that careful. But it doesn't hurt me.
That's not a trigger for you.
And if it was, I would change that. So breakfast is very typically yogurt and a spoonful of soy nut butter just to give it a little bit of thickened texture. I throw in flax seeds and blueberries. That's a typical breakfast for me. Love it. Just love it. That's my fruit for the day. Love it. And then at lunchtime, I'll have some kind of chicken, or maybe I'll have a bit of sausage. I'm not a vegan vegetarian. Anyway, I might have yogurt instead. I love yogurt. And then I'll have some, like for my, I just have to think, carrots and mushrooms that are pre-made like days ago. I have it in the fridge.
So you do some meal prepping.
Oh, absolutely. I do meal prepping all the time. And then at dinner time, I'll have smoked salmon. I don't like cooking, so I don't mind sticking stuff in the oven, but I'm not a instant pot. Like I'm not a cook. I rely on the microwave, and I rely on the oven where I can just throw something in there. So for dinner,
that's good to know, though, just because people often get intimidated.
Yeah,
that they need to know how to cook and take a course in cooking and etc.
No.
Have a lot of gadgets.
Yeah, no, yeah. So that's not me. So at dinner time, I'll have maybe I'll have some more of those roasted carrots and mushrooms. I'll have a big salad with. Now I know how to shop. I'll get like spiralized beets. You can get them already done for you. I get a riced cauliflower. That's a staple for me. I love riced cauliflower. I'll have that. So that's a typical day. No, and I have that around 7 at night. I have 3 meals. That's it. So that I do have a fasting period of sort of 7 to 8 until 8 or 9 the next day. I don't believe in a fast longer than that. It doesn't work for me. But I don't eat snacks in the middle of the night if I'm hungry. That's just the way it goes.
How do you recommend people handle social situations?
Yeah, that's the biggest. Once I got past my own ravenous hunger, which got quiet with this food plan, the biggest hurdle was other people. Other people saying, Vera, are you still on that crazy thing? Have some of this. What I do now, now they know this is Vera and this is what she does, and they leave me alone generally. But now what I'll do is either eat before or after. Like social circumstances are the biggest challenge, put it that way.
Yeah.
So I'll either bring something with me in case I can't eat the food that they have, somehow do a combo of my food and their food. I'm always thinking ahead, though. I don't count on the fact that they're going to do something the way that I want. Like that's just a given. I will often have enough with me that if I can't eat that food, I'll eat my own. Or what I prefer to do is I just don't eat. Just say, you guys can eat or whatever. It's the biggest hurdle, definitely. And like if it's a Christmas thing or something, chances are I'm only going to eat 1/3 or 1/4 of what's on the table. Because it's candied something or other. It's ham, but it's got sugar in it. I can't eat that. That kind of thing.
And how many years have you been doing this for yourself, for professionally, as somebody who's focusing as part of your practice on food addiction?
On food addiction itself, I'd say probably only 3 years. I've been on the road talking about this since the articles that came out from the board of the American Society of Addiction Medicine, which has been at least 10 years now, maybe a bit longer.
So you're seeing more acceptance.
Yes. Now, yes, in the addiction world, yes. In the medical world, slowly, but it's very slow. And in the larger world, I'm seeing acceptance of the concept that food is addictive, but not yet how to treat it with an addiction paradigm. There's still a belief that, yes, even if it's addictive, you still got to learn how to make it so that a person can have a few cookies once in a while.
Would that be akin to an alcoholic saying, well, it's just a Coors Light?
Yeah, it's just a Coors Light, or it's okay to have a beer on your birthday. No, it's not, or a glass of wine, or a sherry, or something nice, a port, a glass. Come on, what's wrong with that? It just can't happen. It just can't happen.
And then if it does, you start over.
Yeah, if it does, you start over. And the thing is, people often what happens, and this happens with alcohol too, the person has that little bit of a drink or that smoke of cigarette, and they go, oh, hey, I was okay. It wasn't that bad. So that means I can have another one because it wasn't that bad. I'm not like going crazy wanting a pack of cigarettes now. But then, so then they have another one the next day, and then it's very quick, but it might not be the first time. That's the thing.
And why is it that the DSM-5 does not recognize food addiction as an actual disease state?
From my understanding of having spoken to at least one group of people, the Food Addiction Institute, which you think people can find online, just foodaddictioninstitute.com. They, amongst many other people who probably, the DSM-5 is basically a big conference of people who, it's almost like lobbying groups to try to say, hey, can you please consider my pet thing as to be included. I saw the letter that they got back from the committee, and they were told binge eating disorder has had a number of years of research to substantiate their diagnosis, binge eating disorder, which was acknowledged for the first time in the DSM-5. And we, as yet, don't see enough of a distinction between binge eating disorder and food addiction to say that food addiction can have its own. So until that happens, it's not saying it won't, but right now we're not going to accept this. You basically need more research. But we've already talked about how muddy this is.
Mm-hmm. Right, because you can have a food addict has anorexia.
Yes.
You can have a food addict who's a binge eater. You can have a food addict who is or is not impacted by obesity.
Exactly. Yes. So I don't know how we're going to get that distinction, but that was the what the letter said. And I don't know. My sense is that we're going to have to be in the same way that we did with cigarettes. It's why we talk about food as the new cigarette thing. That it's going to have to come from the bottom up. We can't wait for the professionals to recognize this. It's going to have to be people saying enough already. We are tired of this, which is slowly happening. And it's why, here I am speaking from a professional point of view, but I'm more and more feeling like this is a political movement that has to also be part of this.
Right.
Yeah. From the bottom up.
Yeah, from our wallets.
Yes, from our wallets.
If money is moving this in one direction towards worsening of disease state and addiction, then money can move it in the other direction.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So if people want to reach you and particularly find out about your challenge, your sugar-free September, how do they reach you?
Get on Facebook and friend me, Vera Tarman, and I will happily invite you into the I'm Sweet Enough September Sugar-Free Challenge. Even when it's beyond September, right? The Facebook page is still there. You can go to my website called addictionsunplugged.com. And there'll be it's going to be changed soon, but it's still there now. And there's an email address there, and you can contact me that way. I do want to say that for Americans, I'm not available as a clinician to treat people because the Canadian medical malpractice insurance will not touch Americans. So I can't. I'm not doing this now with you, as a way to get customers because we just can't do that. But I do want people to still be involved on the other levels of political and Facebook and whatnot. And please pick up my book, Food Junkies: Recovery from Food Addiction.
Mm-hmm. Yes, which I highly recommend, and I will link to on my website. Okay, Dr. Tarman, I really appreciate your time. It's been great to talk to you.
Yeah. We haven't even talked we did talk a little bit about the weight loss bariatric piece, but maybe, I don't know. Yeah. We're good.
Well, with the bariatric piece, in reading your book, I definitely found myself thinking quite a bit about bariatric surgery and kind of running through my patients. And I'm a firm believer in bariatric surgery, but I'm not a firm believer in bariatric surgery for all comers at any point in time. Yeah. I think that it's a very powerful surgery that when it's brought forward as part of the treatment plan, can really take people in directions that they otherwise wouldn't be able to go. But is it curative? Absolutely not.
No. And if a person has gone to the extent of going to and getting surgery, then the last thing you want is to find that you're going to gain the weight that you've lost, to gain it back in 5 or 6 years or whatever. So strengthen that intervention. It's a pretty serious intervention by adding to it, the awareness of food addiction. Whether you're a food addict or not, you don't want to become one.
Right.
And support the weight loss so that it will be maintained for the rest of your life. And it will be if you follow, basically if you don't eat processed foods. Right. I mean, if you follow an understanding of the addictive nature of foods, support the intervention.
I had a patient that I saw. It was a woman. She had had bariatric surgery, and she was about 3 years out, and she was struggling with some weight regain. And she was using cookies in the afternoon because she was bored, lonely, tired. And her husband was with her, and he is not affected by obesity. He does not medicate his emotions with food. And he used himself as an example, talking about getting off of his cigarettes. And he said, well, I quit cigarettes, and that was the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life. And it took me over 6 times, et cetera. But I did it, by golly. And I don't understand why she can't give it up too. And I congratulated him, right? And acknowledged absolutely incredibly hard thing that you managed to do. And just imagine if on the 6th or 7th time you walked into, your local store and you had to walk through the smoking section every single time you walked into that store. And as you were checking out, there were cigarettes lining the aisle and you could smell the smoke, like the triggers that driving you towards that addiction have gone away significantly. Well, the triggers that are driving a person to consume these foods that are socially endorsed and promoted, and, we're shamed if we're not consuming them. What? You don't want these cookies? I made them for you, or I bought them for you. The test for people to abstain from the highly processed carbs, whether it's salty, crunchy, or soft and sweet, this is deep and profound life work, and it's not going to get better or easier quickly. Right. So, my heart, I want people to be prepared. And it's almost like you have to put on your suit of armor every single time you walk out your door or open up a device, whether that device is your television or a screen, your phone. So people have their work cut out for them. And I do think that for those of us who work in bariatric surgery, and many do this, I know, to prepare people and talk to them and help them understand that bariatric surgery is not going to change the obesogenic environment in which you live. So there we go. And that's a lot of the mission of this podcast, is just to raise people's awareness of some of the issues that they might be confronting, so that rather than feeling overwhelmed, they feel empowered. Yes.
Good.
So, okay.
Well, thank you very much for your interview.
Well, you're very welcome. Have a great rest of your day.
Okay. Great questions.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
I hope you found this conversation helpful. I highly recommend you read or listen to Dr. Tarman's book, Food Junkies. In researching this episode, I both read her book and listened to it, and both were great methods to learn more about this very important topic. I will link to her book in my show notes. I also recommend that you listen to my conversation with Dr. Nicole Avina in episode 18 of this podcast for additional information on the addictive nature of some foods, specifically highly processed foods. And Dr. Tarman mentioned foodaddicts.org as an educational resource. I will link to the website in the show notes, but I want to take a few minutes right now to read the questions on their website. Questions meant to help a person understand if part or all of their struggle regarding their relationship with food stems from chemical addiction to food. Do any of these questions ring true for you? Have you ever wanted to stop eating and found you just couldn't? Do you think about food or your weight constantly? Do you find yourself attempting one diet or food plan after another with no lasting success? Do you binge and then get rid of the binge through vomiting, exercise, laxatives, or other forms of purging? Do you eat differently in private than you do in front of other people? Has a doctor or family member ever approached you with concern about your eating habits or weight? Do you eat large quantities of food at one time, also known as a binge? Is your weight problem due to your nibbling all day long? Do you eat to escape from your feelings? Do you eat when you're not hungry? Have you ever discarded food only to retrieve it and eat it later? Do you eat in secret? Do you fast or severely restrict your food intake? Have you ever stolen other people's food? Have you ever hidden food to make sure you have enough? Do you feel driven to exercise excessively to control your weight? Do you obsessively calculate the calories you've burned against the calories you've eaten? Do you frequently feel guilty or ashamed about what you've eaten? Are you waiting for life to begin when you lose the weight? Do you feel hopeless about your relationship with food? I think many people will find some of their struggles described in that list of questions. And this begs another question. What if you're preparing for bariatric surgery and are also confronting a possible food addiction? Should you go forward with surgery before your food addiction is under control? This is an important question to ask. I'm most certainly not here to tell anyone what they should or shouldn't do in this regard. However, in general, I do think that both the power of treatment for food addiction with education, support, and abstinence, and the power of the treatment of obesity with bariatric surgery could potentially occur concurrently, so long as the individual understands which treatment or tool works best for which condition, and then keeps working all the treatment methods forever. In my experience with working with pre- and post-bariatric surgery patients for the past 11 and a half years, I can say that many times people prior to bariatric surgery, when you ask them, have a sense if they're an emotional eater, although they may not be able to easily identify the emotions that trigger emotional eating, or if they know they're triggering emotions, they don't always know how to redirect or heal those emotions. I think identifying chemical addiction to food can be more challenging because really abstaining from potentially problematic foods is very hard to do, even though we can easily make the case that a basic sugar and simple carb abstinence diet is very much in line with a pre-bariatric surgery diet. I know this is generally the nutritional plan we put the majority of our patients on as soon as they start in our program, even if their surgery won't be occurring for many months down the road. But there's no clear-cut guidelines on this in the bariatric surgery world, and let's be honest, it's very difficult to enforce. Therefore, I think it is very likely that many people truly and deeply commit not just to the spirit of low-carb eating, but to the letter of it too, during what is generally considered to be the full liquid pre-op diet phase that on average lasts 1 to 2 weeks before surgery, and then continues with the post-op full liquid diet, which on average lasts 2 weeks after surgery. Again, there's variability from program to program. None of this is standardized. But on average, you have now a 30-day sugar-free and carb-free abstinence phase. Many people struggle with feeling not great during this pre- and post-op period. Do they feel yucky because they're detoxing from sugar in all its forms, or is it because they're recovering from surgery, or both? In general, on the full liquid diet prior to surgery, people can certainly feel hungry and cravings, but typically less than they anticipated. After surgery, on top of the physical symptoms of recovery from surgery in general, the first 2 to 4 weeks after bariatric surgery, people commonly feel exhausted, emotional, achy, and in a brain fog. Again, is this par for the course for everyone regardless of how long they've been sugar-free, or is it worse for people who are only recently abstaining? I don't know. This would be an interesting thing to study. But something else I do notice is that generally, 5+ weeks after surgery, people are feeling better, often a lot better. And not just better compared to right after surgery, I mean better compared to years before. Why do they feel better? I think it's because they're rapidly getting healthier from medical conditions that have made them sick for years. And also, I suspect, because they are off of processed carbs. And they do report a lack of cravings, greater satisfaction, and a lack of hunger like they've never experienced before. People say how they feel about food, how they respond to food is totally different on the other side of bariatric surgery. Even people who were strictly off of sugar and carbs for months prior to bariatric surgery will tell you the experience post-op is different, is easier, because they feel in line with their body, not like they're fighting against their body's independent will. Again, is this because they're free of chemical addiction to food, or is it the gastro-neurohormonal power of the surgery? Honestly, I think it's both. But I do think the gastrohormonal and neurohormonal changes that occur with gastric sleeve, gastric bypass, and duodenal switch are very powerful, independent of the nutritional changes alone. However, let's be honest here, nothing is perfect. Bariatric surgery is not curative, and why we eat is complicated. When we look at the Venn diagram of obesity, chemical addiction to food, and emotional eating, bariatric surgery is a very powerful tool, not a cure, but a tool for the treatment of obesity and, I think, chemical addiction to food. But what about emotional eating? In my opinion, and I think many would agree with me, bariatric surgery is not as powerful a tool for emotional eating in and of itself, right? We've talked about this from numerous different angles in the past 6 years of this podcast. So if you have someone who has obesity and is chemically addicted to food and is an emotional eater, the fire of their struggle can get reunited by using food, processed carbs, to medicate their emotions. Then, as Dr. Tarman talks about, re-engaging with the substance of abuse gets a person right back into their chemical addiction again. The body remembers. And you can see how emotional eating can lead a person back into chemical addiction to food and back into worsening obesity. Or perhaps it's not emotional eating at all, but perhaps simply permissive eating of problematic foods because they never considered chemical addiction to processed foods to be a problem, and no one talked to them about it. And then they find themselves right back into their addiction to processed carbs and at very high risk for weight regain. So what to do? Definitely recognize this is lifelong work. Get educated, get help, and do not give up. I have absolutely seen people slipped back into problematic eating for whatever reason, then struggle with worsening health, including weight regain, and then realize what's going on, get themselves back on track, then get healthier again, including losing weight. The body remembers in both directions. It's just a matter of pointing it in the right direction and then moving forward. Body, mind, and spirit. You gotta be all in. If you find this podcast to be helpful, won't you please tell your friends, family, and bariatric surgery programs all about it? And also, please don't forget to rate the podcast in Apple Casts. All the links that were mentioned in this episode are in the show notes and at my website, weightlosssurgerypodcast.com. You can always email me directly at Reeger, and Reeger is spelled R-E-E-G-E-R, Reeger at weightlosssurgerypodcast.com. I wanted to let you know that I'm not going to be publishing an episode next month, August 2019. I have my summer vacation for part of that month, and I won't have time to get a quality episode out to you, so I've opted to take the month off. I hope you understand. I will see you in September 2019. Okay? Until next time, never forget, I believe in you.
The information provided on this podcast is for general educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent disease. Nor does this information create a patient-provider relationship. Consult your personal licensed healthcare provider about your health concerns before you undertake any health-related regimen or program, or before ingesting any vitamin or supplement products. WeightLossSurgeryPodcast.com.
Hi, Reeger. This is Gwen. Thank you so much for all that you do. I recently finally found the time to stop and become a patron for you. I really do appreciate everything you do for our community of patients and families. This is great. But anyhow, I had a joke for you at the end of your last podcast. You said to call in one, so it's as corny as usual, but here you go. Where do bees go pee? At the BP station. It's a gas station down here in South Florida, in the state of Florida. All right. Have a great day. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Gwen. That was a great joke. And you were the one that took me up on my challenge for people to call in to my Google voicemail with a joke. So thank you so much. And in the spirit of that, the bee jokes anyway, I looked up a few bee jokes myself. So here you go. What do you call a wasp? A wannabe. Why did the bee go to the barber shop? To get a buzz cut. What do you call a bee born in May? A maybe. Okay. Take care, everyone. I'll see you in September.